Welcome to another episode of the Decision Clinic with me, Paul Gordon. Now, just looking at my notes for my next session in the clinic, I'm excited to see I have David Ritter joining me. He's the CEO of Greenpeace Australia. And I would imagine that the challenge in an organization like that, in the world of decision making, there's something about huge long-term decisions. We're talking about the future of the planet. That is not a 5-minute tomorrow decision, yet we need to take action today. So how do we decide on action today for outcomes tomorrow, which some of you may have heard my previous episodes. This is a theme that's been emerging, this long-term, short-term trade-off. And also I imagine the conversation for stakeholders, especially an organization that I imagine has a lot of volunteering, and what does it take to make a decision to volunteer? So these are some of the things I think are going to come out, but I'm excited to hear what David has brought into the Decision Clinic. So welcome, David. Great to have you here. I'm looking forward to this conversation as to how we can support you in your world of decision making. But before we start, it really helps me to understand a little bit about where you're coming from and maybe something about your world of decision making.
I should start by saying thank you for making time to see me in the clinic. I'm sure you've got many patients who are waiting for an appointment. I'm the CEO of Greenpeace Australia Pacific, have been for quite a few years now. And the kinds of decisions that we tend to be making are decisions that really revolve around the central unit of the campaign, the application of resources to strategy towards achieving an objective, and throws up a lot of decision-making challenges.
Goodness. So right there, interesting to explore the uniqueness of that in your organization versus any other organization. You could say that's a CEO's job ultimately, is the application of, let's say, a scarce thing, human resource or financial resource, to solve a problem, to optimize outcomes and maximize value. So if I may ask you a question about, from your perspective, there was a decision that you made that said, Greenpeace looks like the place to go in my career journey, et cetera, et cetera.
Treading onto the ground of personal choices. Well, look, I'd been a lawyer, both worked as a commercial lawyer and as an Indigenous rights lawyer for a First Nations organisation, then found myself in a situation of really recognising the world needs good lawyers. I'd enjoyed being a lawyer, but I really wanted to apply myself to a situation where I was no longer acting for someone else, where I was sort of more in the arena, if you like. I'd always loved Greenpeace for various reasons, going back to even when I was quite a small kid. Had always associated very strongly and been a monthly donor and all those sorts of things. And then, as you sometimes do, I followed a romantic interest across the planet to the UK. We're still together. It's been a source of very great happiness. But also I saw a job ad, I think, on the Guardian website for a senior campaigns position with Greenpeace. And it really was just one of those moments of looking at what they were after, thinking, well, that's not quite me, but maybe I'm close enough. And, you know, here we are 17 years later.
And the rest, as they say, is history.
The rest, as they say.
And so wonderful to hear that as an example, because one of the things I say a lot to people who come into the clinic is this relationship between decision-making and action. And I'm sure this is a topic in your day-to-day world, is without a decision, there is no action. So we have to make a decision to act. And there's something about that. Clearly, you made the decision, even though, as you say, it might be not what they're looking for. But frankly, if I don't take some action, not going to change anything. So it's decision that causes action, that causes outcomes. That's how I like to look at this. So I guess in your day-to-day life, it's full of those kind of decisions at the human level with your volunteers, and kind of maybe just talk us through how that plays out, because I can imagine there's all sorts of interesting dynamics of personal drivers for the planet, drivers for the organization.
Yeah, well, look, what those two things have in common, I mean, the sort of decision to apply to work for Greenpeace, in fact, the decision to no longer be a lawyer, but also the kind of decisions that we make hour to hour, day-to-day basis, is they're premised on a quite clear set of values. I mean, decision to apply to Greenpeace for a role and then to be fortunate enough to be given one was a decision that really came from a sort of gut motivation about values alignment. And in decision-making in every day, that is, I think, where for a values-driven organisation with a purpose of change, our mission is to secure an earth capable of nurturing life in all of its magnificent diversity. That is a mission that is about changing how power functions in the world. You have to, I think, approach decision making in that context from a foundation of values.
That's so wonderful to hear that. It's something I talk a lot about. So to hear it alive in your organization, I think is so important, particularly that decision making is all about trade-offs. There are some, if I do this, I don't get to do that. If I have some of this, I don't get to have some of that. And when we look, as we said a moment ago, about scarce resources in an organization, you could say scarce resources on a planet, for example. The decisions of some of those trade-offs, what's a basis for those decisions? And certainly I see where some of the most effective decisions get made is that let's have a common values framework that in decision world we would call criteria, but effectively a place we can come back to say, how well does this option compared to this option stack up against what matters to me, to my organization? One of the things that's interesting, so I can hear it in what you say, but I'm just interested in your as lived experience, is that alignment between the personal values, the thing that has us go, here's what caused me to get out of bed in the morning, and the organizational values where I work and how those two things fit together. So there's a congruence, or when there's an incongruence, how that causes organizational upset, cultural issues, etc.
Look, it's a profound question. And I think start from the position of very great privilege, which is that if you get to put whatever abilities and energy you've got in the service of your values, then you start from a good place. And I think a vision for society would actually be a vision for society where we have a set of laws and regulations. We have a system, if you like, that means that people can simply go to work in confidence that their workplace is not sort of incidentally doing some terrible harm to the planet because there's some setting of laws and regulations that allows that to take place. That I think should be the ideal, that people are easily enabled to align values and what they do at work. I think you face sometimes a quite different, in a sense, challenge in a purpose-driven organisation like Greenpeace, because the wonderful people with whom I've been genuinely and humbly blessed to work with, some of the most wonderful, committed, compassionate, talented human beings over the years, people do come to Greenpeace often with a very developed social conscience. And that social conscience does come into contact with, as you say, finite resources. And, literally the worst thing, or one of the worst things about a job that I love, is that moment when you realise you can't do something about a thing because resources are finite, and because if you spread yourselves too thin, you will, lose on all fronts. Those are not great decisions to make, but they are also necessary decisions to make.
Yeah, and that's interesting to hear that. Particularly, I talk a lot about in decision making. A term I use frequently is constraint. So there's a constraint here called resource might be a constraint, or legislation might be a constraint, or the fabric of society might be a constraint. And how do we operate inside of those constraints, but still have some freedom of decision making? And what does that look like? So I think that's an interesting example of that. And when I think of those values or criteria and the trade-offs between them, the opportunity for decision making is to be conscious in those trade-offs and go, actually, and I have to admit, a lot of leaders I see aren't strong in the what's the bit we don't do. So it's one thing to say, we can see the commitment that we're making, here's the things that we do need to do, but in order to do those well, what's the stuff we're not going to do that we might otherwise be doing poorly? And so there's also the other side, how you decide what not to do.
Yes.
Which I imagine that's a similar situation in your case.
Oh, look, it is. And I think it's something that I have, I look back on a number of years of being in a role that I love for an organisation that I love, and what I tend to dwell on are the things I would do differently, knowing now what you do. And I can certainly see umpteen circumstances over the years when there's been a degree of wishfulness in my mind about what was possible with the resources that are available. And I think I'm now blessed to work with a really good team, and we have some very good conversations. And it is the balance, because we are in this moment of climate and ecological emergency. So we have to be as ambitious as we possibly can be in this moment. And that means having targets for fundraisings. We don't accept any money from any government or any business. So targets for fundraising that are ambitious to enable campaigns that are themselves highly ambitious, and then work plans and strategies to match to achieve those campaign aims that are ambitious. But it all has to still be within the realms of the real, because as you say, if it drifts into that territory of not a proper evaluation of what resources you actually have, what you're not going to do, then you are not being effective. You are just being wishful.
It's interesting you mention where you're funded from. So it's entirely membership based. Is that this is my understanding, so of course you'll know it much better than me, but there's no contribution from government grants or anything like that. There's a decision right there, right? The organization made a decision that said this is, and one of the reasons I'm interested in this, in kind of how you made that decision, is this just resonates with the former person who came into my clinic, a guy called Rob Kaslik. He runs a social enterprise called Too Good. And in fact, the decision he brought into the clinic was this challenge of there's plenty of money that's being put in his direction, but his commitment for empowering women from shelters and so on to enable them into the workplace is we need to direct our resources the way we need to direct our resources for the good that we do. And as soon as money comes in from outside, it has strings attached, which might take us in directions we want to go. So it's just interesting to hear the parallel side from your perspective, a very different organization, but you've made a similar decision. So perhaps you could speak a little bit about that, how that sort of plays out.
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, that was frankly not a decision that I made. It was a decision that I inherited as a global Greenpeace position. So it's not just Greenpeace Australia Pacific, but any Greenpeace anywhere in the world. No government money, no business money. Money comes from supporter subscriptions, one-off appeal gifts, and some private family trusts and foundations. And that decision also has a set of subcategories to it around decisions around campaign choice are made independently. They're not so. And that has consequences for the kind of work that we do and for the way that we are able to prosecute work. And I have had, I lose track of the number of conversations over the years where someone, particularly in a business, has said, look, Ritter, you've made a bit of a nuisance of yourself, but what I respect about Greenpeace is that you're not coming here asking for some trade-off with us.
Yeah.
You're coming here out of your... Now, I also want to be very clear. I'm not critical of other organisations that have different business models because there's obviously room for different business models in the world. But for us, it is really a core part of the identity and fuels that independence.
Yeah. I can hear the freedom that comes with that to pursue your commitment. So one of the things I like to do, just point to a few things that you talk to for the benefit of people listening, is it points to the fact that a dollar isn't a dollar. Often we think of that, and often decision making is very much driven by more dollars there is better than less dollars over there. Whereas what I hear is a dollar from here is a different dollar than a dollar from over here. And it comes with something that's associated with that. And so that's a really interesting concept for us to keep present to, is it isn't simply decision making isn't simply where's the biggest pile, it's that one, I'll take that one, thanks very much. It's actually what's the intangible things that come with that dollar, the support, the commitment, the messaging that provides for the freedom to spend the dollar in certain ways, etc.
It's almost there's a sense of the democratic dollar, that one of the consequences of that mass regular support base, and the truly sort of humbling moments when someone I'll meet at a mate's place or something will say, oh, Greenpeace, I've supported you for 27 years. And and people are often quite sort of self-effacing about this. It's not much. But the truth is that the reason Greenpeace exists, the only reason Greenpeace exists, is because hundreds of thousands of people all around the world believe in the organisation, so they put that democratic dollar into keeping the thing going. And I hope that people who are part of the family in that way do look out at the whales that swim past and think, well, that's because I contributed a democratic dollar to enable this campaign work to keep going all over the world, and feel the same way about successful campaigns around forests and the saving of Antarctica from industrial development and all the rest of it, and feel a sense of hope going forward.
It's also wonderful to hear you say that piece about see the whales swim by, because one of the challenges in decision making often is the relationship between making the decision and seeing the outcome from the decision that we made. And a little bit, as I said just before, the challenge between a short-term action, which might be a short-term cost, literally handing over money as a short-term cost, and I might not see any outcome from that money until the whale swims past, and that might not be for a generation. So I'm interested in your experience of how you, your team, but then also your supporters and your volunteers, how they are dialing in that sort of decision making between I make what might be a difficult decision for some people. The few dollars is a very difficult decision. Make that difficult decision, knowing that really the effect of it could be a long way away. Yeah. I imagine this is something that you're dealing with all the time in terms of messaging for support and so on.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, whether someone is supporting at $20 a month or whatever I was supporting Greenpeace at before and subsequently, or whether it's a family trust and foundation at a sort of higher level, you do recognise that it's a moral decision, and it's a decision with people who themselves have scarce resources. And no, we'll take this opportunity to say thank you as well for everyone who does support in that kind of way. But that, again, that point you make about it's almost a dialectic between present and future.
Yeah.
And particularly in a context of climate and environmental ecological emergency, you take a day like today where we've commented how hot we are in this beautiful podcast, beautiful clinic, I should say. It's an absurdly hot day because of global warming, driven above all by burning of coal, oil and gas. Now, our volunteers, our activists, our supporters, our staff team, people are feeling this and they're feeling it in a deep way. And that sense of being able to try and hold in your head both the moment of distress about what you can feel happening to the world, to also hold in your head the projections of BAU, which are absolutely catastrophic, and to know that there are already some things that are baked in that we can't do anything about, but also to know that there are things that we can do. I was looking at some data sets from earlier this week from a researcher called Hannah Ritchie in the UK, who has got it's tentative, but it's also not uncompelling to suggest that we might have actually reached peak global pollution.
Right. Yeah.
So we're in this moment where everything feels like it's on the hinge of fate, and you're all the time having to make that decision-making while there is this radical spectrum of possible futures ahead of us.
Yeah. So yes, there's a sort of an immediacy, and then there's, as you say, the dialectic between now and the future. And that's interesting you say that. And one of the things that occurs to me is, and I suppose this is one of my personal passions, is really how we shift decision making to, in fact, my vision for the future is everyone has a say in decisions that matter to them. There's a new world of agency in any domain, whatever the domain might look like. And one of the challenges, of course, people say is, well, that's not possible. How do you manage that with millions of people? Imagine the entire population of Australia could contribute to decisions that govern. How can that look? And so I'm interested in your world, and I don't know any of the numbers, so maybe you could give me a couple of the numbers, but in terms of the numbers of donors, contribers, members, however you refer to them, how would you say they participate in the decisions that you're making that matter to them? How would you say that works out in practice?
Well, I think the connectivity between the mass of human beings who believe in the vision of an Earth capable of nurturing life in all of its magnificent diversity, who are committed to a place where, to use your language, there's more attention to the long term, where people and planet are nurtured rather than seen as being just subjects of extraction. That large number of people, and then what the staff team of Greenpeace actually does, the connectivity is what we refer to as engagement.
Yeah.
And that engagement is the source of all the power that Greenpeace is able to muster in the world. It comes from that connectivity. So the feedback loops include and are meant to be present all the time. They're there on every campaign tactic when there is an ability for people to engage through, whether it's engaging directly now through various social media platforms, or because there is an action that is available to take place, or it's there in terms of the kind of connectivity that I guess most organisations do when you ask your people what they think about particular things. And you also, of course, do, surveys on how you're going, the organisational health surveys, those sorts of things.
Yes. So if I look at that, and kind of sorry for being a bit, what's the word, practical about it, but
please be practical.
Yeah, but as a
we like practical
as a vehicle of engaging decision making. A petition is a vehicle, right? That someone's made a decision to put their name on something to say, here's what I'm committed to, and I'm empowering you to take action on my behalf through my decision making. So that I'm really interested in, again, part of my outside of the clinic world is looking at what does that look like? What are the practical ways that we can make that, really bring that alive so that people are free to, with some of the options they face. And again, fundamental to decision making is having options to choose between rather than the one option called do this or don't do it. But it's like, where can I pick my path? And if I can compare my options, it gives me more insight into why I might be interested in one or the other. So I think that's very interesting to hear that as an example of what I would call stakeholder participation in decision making. And forgive me because it's just occurs to me, this might be a little trite, but it also occurs to me that so one of the challenges in decision making is how to have a broad spectrum of stakeholders participate. We know diversity improves decision outcomes. One of the things that occurs to me for an organization like yours is, of course, you're bringing in stakeholders who don't normally have a voice. For example, the whales. You mentioned the whales earlier. That's why I say it's a bit trite. It's a little bit silly to think of a whale going, yeah, I support you or whatever. But I'm interested in that. That is how do we represent stakeholders' perspectives who maybe can't bring their perspectives to the table, or who maybe are unwilling, or whatever it might be. And I guess there's a part of that in your world as well. If you look at who's actually the beneficiaries of the work that you do, it is the planet is something that doesn't get to speak, for example.
Look, that's a really enlightening way to think about life on Earth, actually. I'll think about that some more. But in a sense, I mean, life fights for life. And if you take a position where you're an environmental campaigning organisation, in a sense, when you're taking heed of the scientific information about the state of ecology, then that is, if you like, almost a census of the popular view of the creatures on Earth. Because if things are not going well, that is actually an expression of life. And it's not just there in the scientific data. Again, it's there in the individual experience of people. I mean, if those of us of a certain age can remember that nighttime experience of insects splattered on the windscreen of cars. That no longer happens because insect populations have simply plunged. Now, that's a common experience, but there are many others where if you test with people of a certain age, they'll just say, no, I haven't seen that in a while, or you used to get a lot around here. So that's the ecological side of things. But then on the human side of things, because we do come to environmental campaigning with a justice lens, it's absolutely fundamental that you work in solidarity, you work in collaboration, and you are led by the communities, the allies that you're working with. So, again, a terrific sort of practical example of this is there's an extraordinary piece of litigation on foot to take a case for an advisory ruling on the obligations of states to protect citizens from human rights abuses to the International Court of Justice. Now, I'm very pleased and proud that Greenpeace has played a real role in providing back-of-house support, communication support, political lobbying around it. But that is our work in support of an idea, a campaign that was dreamt up in a classroom, believe it or not, by law students in Vanuatu, and has been championed by a set of Pacific communities and leaders, particularly this incredible group of students. So that campaign is all about, if you like, being led by, taking the cue from, in this instance, some of the communities who are the most affected first by severe climate damage.
Wow. Okay. They're really valuable to hear that kind of example, that an idea gets cooked up, some decisions get made to take some action, and then that causes some other decisions that get made, and look where that's getting us to.
And there's a toughness in that, right? Because if the story was only one of bad things are happening here, then what's the theory of change attached to it?
Yes, yeah.
So what one of the the dilemmas are in the decision making we face, one of the dilemmas is always, if there isn't an actionable theory of change, then there's no campaign to run.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, can you do that one again because it's slow?
There's nothing that you can do about it, and they are some of the hardest situations.
Yes. Oh, yes, indeed. So one thing I've heard, David, is you as a CEO and a leader, and I'm always interested in the leadership journey as well, as a leader of an organization like Greenpeace, clearly very purpose-driven. During COVID, when your only source of funds is donation, effectively, then that's a time when everyone's looking at, what's all the discretionary stuff. And I guess that it must have been financially very tricky for an organization like Greenpeace. And it came with many organizations making headcount cuts and so on. And I want to reflect on this. And I see this pointing to what works in decision making was when it came to that moment that you had to inform the organization of who needed to go, the support you had as a leader in those tricky moments that none of us as leaders want to make, right? Which would say, I'm sorry, we have to let you go. You did that in a whole organizational forum. And what had led to that was a lot of transparency in the decision making, how you were in the conversations that happened, the level of transparency about it, that meant when it came to make the decision and the announcement, the support that came with it was kind of a result of how you'd gone about it. Feel free to say that's not the case at all and it was more to do with something else, but I'm just interested in that because it's a very powerful leadership example.
Yeah, no, look, I'm happy to talk about it because I think it's, it's important to be transparent and vulnerable about these things. And COVID arrived on us with, as you say, the same sorts of impact I think a lot of organisations faced. We were also at a particularly vulnerable point in our investment cycle in a way that, you sort of decide this is the time to outlay on that thing you've been meaning to do. Yep. So, it came along at the wrong time. And it was difficult. We did have to let go quite a number of people. And I don't mind sharing, I asked my board whether they wanted me to continue at that point, because sometimes those moments are moments of leadership renewal, and sometimes when there is a thing you love, and I do love the role, you've got to be prepared to give up the thing you love because you love it. And when the board had a bit of a think and said, look, just go and work it out. And so there was an approach that we took that really began sort of from a premise of, well, if we're really having to pull things back here, what is our truest truth? What are our core strengths? What are our imperishable values? And, let's be able to look each other in the eye and be honest about these with that sort of really critical honesty, because we just don't have the resources or the time to engage in any wishful thinking here. But also there was a sort of sense within the terrific leadership team that I was in, and also stemming from the board, of, well, what would it mean to go through this in the most inclusive possible way, but also making a really authentic commitment that we are going to look after people, and that no one is going to feel like that they're blamed, that it's their fault, that if you happen to be one of the really terrific people that we just can't fit in the salary envelope anymore, that that you're good at what you do, and we're going to support you into getting into a new role. And the consequences of this extraordinary period, and it really was group leadership. It was leadership, certainly from the leadership team, but the leadership across the organisation, cross-directional, really recognising interdependencies, was just remarkable. And what it resulted in was, despite the fact that we lost a significant number of our people, our internal culture surveys actually improved over the course of that time.
Yeah.
They've remained good, really good. And you don't take these things complacently at all, because the world is dynamic. Culture is a journey. You're always going to have ups and downs, and you shouldn't, panic at that if and when it happens. But also the core, the alignment of what we were good at, what our strengths were, what we were going to do, was hardened in a good way. It was tempered in the fires of that. And so coming out the other end of it, people were nurtured into new roles. We did look after people. So there was just that sense of togetherness, alignment. We've got through this. If we've got through this, we're pretty much up for a bunch of other things. And really a sort of run of fantastic campaign successes followed that really difficult year. I think it really take my hat off to all the folks I'm lucky enough to work with who've just contributed to that, and everyone who stayed with Greenpeace on that journey.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. Something that's close to your heart. So there's a lot of lessons in there, of course, and far be it for me to point to all of them, but certainly it sounds like that level of transparency and authentic engagement in it as a process is one of the things that led to, as you say, a measure of the outcome is how high the staff engagement is and the nature of the culture now. I'm always interested in what anyone who's listening can go, I hadn't thought of it that way, but that's really helpful for me.
And I asked people, it's quite humbling when you're sort of in the middle of whatever career you might be, and you've been around in a role long enough to have to own your own mistakes. You have to take a look at yourself and not only be prepared to fully disclose where things have reached, but also to openly and honestly ask people for their opinions on what you should do. And if you are used to being a decision maker and all those things, that's not necessarily instinctive. So it was a real, relearning of how wise people are, how generous people are, and how when you give people the opportunity to give you advice, overwhelmingly people will respond with generosity, with the bigness of their character, and whatever schadenfreude they might feel gets put away for another day. it was an overwhelmingly, in the end, positive experience, notwithstanding how difficult it was. And I do not want to underestimate that it was difficult.
Yeah, thank you. And I love hearing just in that last commentary the sort of underlying assumption called, let's assume that people are generous. But there's something underlying the human condition that sometimes we see ourselves it not showing up that way. But if we operate from that's there somewhere, then that gives us a different basis for our decision making, I guess.
Yeah, and there's sort of transparency to enable that as well. I mean, within the terrific staff team, I mean, obviously the folks who was most difficult for were those who no longer had roles at the end of it. So I want to absolutely emphasise that. Yeah. But I had a philosophy going through it that I sort of repeated until I was sick of saying it, was any question, any time, any channel. So whatever people wanted to ask, you want to see, X figures, or ask why I made that decision, or why did we invest in this, or how did we come to fix on that strategy, or why aren't we doing this, or fine and great. And that was not my idea. That was an idea I got from someone else and thought, that sounds right.
And you made the decision to put that into place, right? So thank you for sharing that. That's extremely valuable and moving to see your leadership shine through there and the group leadership. This is the Decision Clinic. Have you stepped through this door with something that you're grappling with that I can support you in any realm? Where to go on holiday next?
No, I mean, I immediately went to, the conversations one might have with one's kids about tidying rooms or something like that. But I think, no, it's not the kind of conversation. No, look, I think in a sense, the dilemma in Australia at the moment is what to make of the federal Labor. So to illustrate it, we saw the really profoundly, Greenpeace campaign, a lot of others campaigning too, great collaboration, supporting Minister Chris Bowen's really effective fuel efficiency standard introduced at a federal level. Terrific piece of policy making. But in the same little stanza of time, you see the federal government come out with a future gas strategy, which imagines opening up new gas fields offshore, despite the fact the International Energy Agency, which is, hardly a lefty ratbag organisation, has said there should be no new coal, oil or gas opened up. So we've got this position of a sort of strangely ambivalent, almost dual personality government. And so the decision all the time, I think, is how does one approach decision making in a situation of such with that dual political character, but also where you have all of the dimensions that exist in that world of geographical differences, ideological differences, personality differences, factional differences. All of those things are live and they are real. And when you have the sort of pressure of public discourse, if you like, is always simplistic. It's binary. Are you with? Are you against? Will you slam or will you praise? So the question really is, how do you maintain the necessary level of sophistication, of nuance, of space when the situation is really complicated and the pressure is really binary?
Oh, that's I'm probably not going out on a limb by saying they're probably the toughest question that someone's brought. And I think, I'd like to say the short answer is, and of course there is no short answer. It reminds me of a commentary I often make around, let's say, a referendum as a vehicle. So back to that binary, are you with or are you against? One of the challenges in decision making, as soon as someone asks us to take a position, we as humans are basically cognitively biased to stick with that position, because changing our position has to admit that we were wrong in the first place. So as soon as you take a stand called, which way do you vote on this referendum, as an example, which is a binary vehicle, as soon as someone says, and I'll use a non-Australian example in Brexit, as soon as someone says stay or go, you've got to pick now, even before you get to actually putting your cross in the box. When someone asks you, I'm interviewing in the street, what do you think? What do you think, David? Stay or go? As soon as you say it, it's very hard to move your position. So the fundamental failure in that situation is, firstly, we've created a binary situation. Decisions are always much better weighed with a range of options. So let's not have it be stay or go, with or against. Let's have it be some spectrum that allows us to find a different way in there. So that's one, I guess I'm pointing to the challenge rather than an answer to it. It's how do we frame it differently so it's not are you with or against? And then I think the complexity question is really, how do we elevate the conversation so that it's in pieces we can deal with? Often with other patients in my clinic and so on, I'm grappling with this. There's a lot of complexity, very small moving parts, but actually we need to be making a decision at a higher level where we can kind of chunk things up a little bit and start to say, well, how do these big pieces relate to each other? What are the big trade-offs? Not the tiny little trade-off called, I don't know, one vote here versus one vote there, but the much bigger trade-off called the macro issues, particularly because, and experts in negotiation and so on would say, how do you elevate the conversation sufficiently to find the common ground? What's the place where all stakeholders, and, you know, I think of stakeholders in literally all circles of the compass rather than on the two sides of for or against. You look at stakeholders in all circles of the compass. How can we get to a place where there's at least something that we're agreeing on, even if all we're doing is agreeing on the issue? It brings to mind an example which will be close to your heart, and might be it's a bit before your time, but was a UK government example around nuclear waste. You know, an environmental issue, a big, very complex issue, lots of moving parts and lots of data that can be misread and misunderstood and so on. And the challenge in that decision was you can only make one decision. The decision was, where do we store nuclear waste? So it's a clear that we've got to get to an outcome. It was a very interesting constraint called, we can't, regardless of your opinion on the power generation industry, and even if you stop the industry at that moment, you still had the waste to deal with. So you can't not deal with the issue. So the challenge was, well, what do you do about that? Especially when you've got everyone from organizations like yours at one end of the spectrum called, we shouldn't have it in the first place, to others up the other end of the spectrum saying it's the cleanest, and lots of different opinion. And the challenge there was, well, what do you do about that? The answer to that was, and this was, of course, driven by the government, who had the accountability for dealing with this. So you might say an organization not that interested in maybe with a stronger political agenda than any other agenda. And the answer was, well, how do you elevate the issue? Firstly, you've got to get clear on everything. So clarity is a great help. The clarity is, we've got this stuff, we can't not have it. So we don't need to take up a bunch of time saying we shouldn't have it because it's there. Okay, we can all agree on that. Okay, we can agree on that. We can agree on some other constraints. And one of the constraints was, it has to be as close to zero risk solution as possible. So sticking it on a rocket and sending it to the sun, which is probably an effective answer, frankly, you know, the impact of that is low until the rocket falls out of the sky and then you're in trouble. So that's off the table as well. And sending it to France was off the table as well. I don't just mention France for any other reason, any other country. It had to be something that was within the shores of the UK. So dealing with that challenge, okay, we can all agree on those are constraints. So what is our degrees of freedom? So let's build a range of options that range from something like, how do we put it in such a place we could never see it again and it's as far away and as safe as possible, to let's put it in a place where future technology might allow us to suddenly make a great use of this, a reuse of this resource that we've already done something with. Again, a spectrum of options that everyone could see themselves in. So what you're doing is effectively taking the complexities, chunking it up into, here's a set of options. Different stakeholders could see their ideas in those options. And then, okay, let's all agree on what the trade-offs are. And we know there's trade-offs around environmental impacts from the radiation and so on. We know there's trade-offs around economic impacts from et cetera, et cetera. So we can all agree what those trade-offs are. And so by shaping the conversation in that way, you haven't yet had the discussion, which side are you on or not? You haven't even asked that question. You've said what matters to you, what's some ideas. By shaping it in that way, it meant when it came to the conversation called, okay, let's break it down. If we look at, let's say, an environmental impact, how do our different options stack up against each other? Everyone can participate in that conversation, knowing that, yeah, their concern might not be an environmental concern. It might be an economic concern. Well, we're going to come to that in a separate conversation. So what worked there? So I'm kind of using this as an example of a very complex problem that could easily turn into the binary. The key was a massive broad range of stakeholders. So there wasn't we don't want those people here because we know they're not going to like what we're doing. No, let's make sure they're at the table. And then let's elevate it to some real options. We can all say, well, they're options. I'm not saying I like one or not, but I know they are options. And then let's look at those options through lenses that we can agree, which are the fundamental trade-offs. Yeah, we can agree that there's environmental impacts. We can agree that there's economic outcomes. Okay, we can agree on those. All of that sort of shaping work allows for, then when it comes to the how do they compare to each other, we've got a basis that we've agreed on. In fact, I would say probably one of the key points to that is having the stakeholders agree on the process by which you're going to make a decision. So this idea of, before we even get to which way do you go, for or against, go, well, at least we'll make the decision in this way. And that way allows for, that's an agency kind of conversation, which I realize is tricky when you then look at and immediately to a political context and go, well, the process is already set. It's called voting or it's called a referendum. So we've kind of had no say in the process. I know that's where the challenge is. Perhaps not answering the question directly, but just wanted to use an example to illustrate ways in which I can see we can start to deal with this high complexity added as well, which I'm sure this is the case in your world, by not just the complexity, but some of the technical challenges and the data and the science that for many people who would care wouldn't understand it. It's not their field to understand geotechnology or to understand nuclear radiation. So you've also got that added complexity as well. So that's kind of a way I tend to think about how we might look at that as a sort of big picture answer to your question. I don't know if that provides anything.
I think it does, in the sense that it's quite sort of reassuring to hear that, embracing the complexity of the situation rather than sort of simply saying, oh no, you've got to choose a binary. So I think that's sort of quite reassuring and quite helpful. And I suppose the sort of unfair thing in a way, in a sort of clinical context, is the decision I'm sort of asking you around is one in which there's a lot of decision-making that goes on that is not decision-making sort of premised on liberal, rational ideas of how decision-making should work. And so you can turn up to an argument with do we all agree about the laws of physics?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, we don't. Oh, okay, right.
We're back to square one as well.
Well,
Yes.
so and I suppose I'm interested in, as a decision-making clinician, how much of a challenge is that sort of sense that people are increasingly the post-truth challenge, I guess?
That's a really good question. And I'll answer it in two ways. One way is a slightly self-serving answer, because the thing that where I get upset about is when the answer comes back, which is, well, people are too dumb to know. So the complexity, that post-truth, it's like, well, they can't even understand the truth.
One thing I think you and I agree on absolutely fundamentally as an article of true faith is that human beings should be trusted, that human beings are social creatures who will do good given half a chance, and human beings should be trusted. Couldn't agree more.
Yes, exactly. So that's a mindset shift that's needed in that direction. But the other answer to your question, the challenge is, do we even agree on the truth? So do I believe the laws of physics? And if the answer is no, I don't, what do I do? The challenge there and the opportunity there is to say, well, let's find the bit that we do agree on. And I don't want to put this, project into your world, but I can imagine, and I know from having grown up in the 80s, the UK, the conversation for climate change, is it even a thing, right? We know there's been plenty of conversation. Now, one would like to imagine we're past that. But back then there is the post-truth called, unless you at least accept that as something to have our attention on, all of everything else is going to take us away from the conversation. Frankly, I could just get to put my hand up and say, oh, come on, you're making it up. So I think there is what is the truth that we can agree on? The other thing in decision-making is, and it's interesting, is often not the case, is we only actually need to think of the bits of truth that are relevant to the decision that we're making. Often the other bits of the truth that we might argue about actually have no bearing on this as a specific decision. So that's another complexity conversation or a causality conversation. But if really we're okay with this model of the truth that we can agree on, that might be requisite for this particular decision we're making. So good, we don't need to worry about this other stuff. One of the fallacies in decision making is you need sort of infinite perfect data to be able to make a decision. And the reality is, well, you're never going to have infinite perfect data. Decisions are about the future, which isn't yet written. So, let's get past that and say, what do we actually need that will inform us sufficiently, given the right environment and the right context, to make sensible decisions, give the support that's needed, the requisite level of data, and be okay with the other stuff that we don't know about, don't understand, or is in the world of uncertainty. And that's a very topical thing, especially COVID has shown that, humans, when they get present to uncertainty, regardless of how much uncertainty there is, when they get present to it and it's in their face, it's not a happy place for us as humans to operate. We'd rather imagine more certainty. And so that's part of it as well, I'd say.
And do I also hear in what you're saying that when you're seeking agreement or an outcome or something, you don't need complete values alignment. It doesn't matter if you and I agree on whether green shirts are the best colour to wear to meetings. What matters is that we can agree on changes to the way land is managed or water is used or something. What matters is the issue.
That's perfect. The green shirt is a perfect example. You and I might have different opinions, and clearly, literally, we have a black and white opinion. So we have different opinions about, and for those listening in black and white, we're wearing black and white shirts. So we might have a different opinion about that, but we might share an opinion that the color of the shirt is something that matters to how you feel about yourself. And now that's something we can agree on. And you might say green and I might say blue. And so how do we get to that conversation? What's the place that allows us to bring our different perspectives, have our own views of what the right answer is, but have a basis for the conversation about it?
So I do think, if I may say, that's a really important insight. And now thinking back, I can think of a number of really clear examples of this from sort of time with Greenpeace where there's been a sort of historical struggle between the fisheries sector and Greenpeace. And then there's been this sort of coming together of, well, hang on, we actually agree with each other around an overwhelming number of issues here. Can we sort of, put the rest to, and no, the common fisheries policy, notoriously sexy subject, but also notoriously difficult to reform. It actually ends up in some really important structural reform because of those conversations that were about, hey, actually, we probably do agree on about 90 to 95% of all of this stuff.
Yes. Yeah, great.
I can see you looking, like you need a nap after just hearing the words common fisheries policy, but it's fascinating stuff and important, very important.
Exactly. There's many phrases we've had today in this session in the clinic that I've never had in the clinic before. So 10 out of 10 for uniqueness in the conversation. And with that, our time is up. So David, really thank you for engaging in this far-reaching conversation that's kind of gone from the planet down to individuals and back again. And I've enjoyed the discussion. I hope it's given you some insights in the world of decision making, and definitely it will have been value to our listeners. So thank you, David.
No, thank you very much.
So, wow, what a conversation around many broad range of issues. So great privilege to have the discussion with David Ritter. And I think, a few things to point out. Richness of stakeholder environment is something that commonly comes up in decision making, and organizations generally we hear are poor at that. And so how do we find ways to really engage with that broad stakeholder base, and how do we elevate a conversation to a level that allows us to have some kind of common ground so that we can move forward? Because ultimately we actually all care about making decisions that lead us to good outcomes. So great conversation. See you on the next episode.